My name is George, and I'm an older man who has always found peace in fishing. Living in upstate New York, I discovered an isolated lake, far from the hustle and distractions of modern life. That lake became my sanctuary, a place where I could relax and reflect. One autumn afternoon, the sky was gray, and the cold breeze signaled the arrival of winter. I decided to go to the lake for what might be the last fishing trip of the year. I prepared my gear, grabbed my old tackle box, and drove to the lake. The path was surrounded by tall trees, and the fallen leaves formed a golden carpet under my feet. When I arrived, the lake was deserted, as usual. The calm waters reflected the cloudy sky, creating a sense of absolute tranquility. I set up my camping chair on the shore, cast my line, and settled in, patiently waiting for a fish. As I waited, I noticed movement on the other side of the lake. 3 figures were there, frantically digging a hole near the water. The scene looked sinister from a distance. They worked quickly, as if they were afraid of being discovered. Intrigued, I tried to observe more closely. The figures, dressed in dark clothes, seemed to be throwing something into the hole. After a few minutes, they stopped digging and began carrying items to the edge of the lake. The items were thrown into the water, one by one, making a hollow sound as they hit the surface. My heart raced. Something was definitely wrong. They weren't fishermen or people having a picnic. They were hiding something, and it didn't seem good. I continued to watch, trying not to be seen. After some time, the figures seemed to have finished what they were doing. They quickly gathered and disappeared into the forest, leaving the lake deserted and silent again. I waited a few minutes, making sure they were really gone, before summoning the courage to investigate. I got up from my chair, felt the adrenaline surge through my body, and walked to the spot where I saw them digging. The soil was disturbed and wet, indicating that something had been buried there recently. I looked at the water where they had thrown the items and wondered what could be hidden there. When the figures disappeared into the forest, my curiosity overcame my fear. I picked up a sturdy old branch to help me poke around in the water and began to explore the area where the items had been thrown. Kneeling by the lake's edge, I carefully stirred the dark water with the branch. After a few minutes, something hard and metallic hit the branch. I held my breath and plunged my hand into the cold water, feeling around until I grasped a solid object. I pulled it out carefully, and to my surprise and horror, it was a gun. It was old and rusty, but still clearly recognizable. My heart raced, and adrenaline took over. I knew I needed to call the police immediately. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I quickly explained the situation, and the operator assured me that a patrol car would be sent to the location as soon as possible. While I waited, I couldn't stay still. I continued to stir the water, feeling an increasing urgency to discover what else might be hidden there. Soon, I found another object, a bunch of keys. There were several keys of different shapes and sizes, some with inscriptions almost worn away by time. Shortly after, the police arrived. 2 officers got out of the patrol car and cautiously approached me. "Are you the one who called?" one of the officers asked. "Yes, that was me. I found a gun in the lake, and I think there are more things in there," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The officers examined the gun and the keys, exchanging worried glances. Then one of them approached the water and began to help with the search. Not long after, we found a finely crafted silver locket with an old photo inside. It was of a young woman smiling sadly at the camera. The locket had an air of something precious and personal. "This is getting stranger by the minute," murmured one of the officers. They collected all the items we found and started to inspect the area around the dug-up hole. They took photos, made notes, and tried to understand what might have happened there. Throughout the process, I felt a growing unease. Those mysterious figures, the items we found, something didn't add up. After a few hours, the officers thanked me for my cooperation and said they would investigate the case thoroughly. They promised to keep me informed, but as they walked away, I felt that the mystery was far from being solved. I returned home that night with a heavy feeling in my chest. The image of the rusty gun, the keys, and the locket wouldn't leave my mind. I knew that somehow it all meant something much bigger and more sinister than I could imagine. In the days that followed, life seemed to return to normal, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every little sound at night, every shadow moving in the wind, made me think of the mysterious figures at the lake. The police investigated the case, but couldn't find a clear link between the items and any recent crime or disappearance. "We're still investigating, sir, but so far, we don't have anything concrete," said one of the officers when I called to check on the progress of the case. The frustration and insecurity grew. The lack of a clear resolution left me uneasy and anxious. I started noticing signs that maybe I was being watched, quick movements in the shadows around my house, soft noises at night. Everything contributed to the growing paranoia. The first time I noticed something strange was when I heard soft footsteps in the yard. I looked out the window but saw nothing. I thought it might be an animal, but the feeling of being watched was persistent. The following nights were similar, with inexplicable sounds and shadows that seemed to move at the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of insecurity didn't go away. I started doubting my own sanity. Every noise, every movement seemed to confirm that I was being watched. The feeling of being under constant observation became unbearable. I decided to install security cameras around the house. I wanted proof, something to confirm or deny my suspicions. The cameras were strategically placed, covering all the entrances and blind spots. I began monitoring the footage obsessively, looking for any sign of intrusion. The first few nights revealed nothing. The constant monitoring increased my anxiety, but I was determined to discover the truth. Then, in one of the recordings, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Two shadowy figures were moving around my house, silently passing between the trees. They paused briefly in front of the cameras, as if they knew they were being watched, and then disappeared into the darkness. My heart raced. There was no more doubt. I was being watched. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the figures had disappeared. I showed them the footage, and the officers promised to increase patrols in the area, but the sense of security was far from restored. Each night became a battle against fear and paranoia. Every sound, every shadow was a constant reminder that something sinister was happening. The psychological impact was devastating. I could barely sleep, and my mind was always on alert, waiting for the next sign of intrusion. Then, one night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard soft footsteps outside. My heart pounded, and all the suspicions and fears I'd been accumulating came to a head. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and grabbed a flashlight and an old hunting rifle I kept for protection. I walked to the window and looked out, the flashlight off so as not to alert whoever was out there. I saw shadows moving around the yard, indistinct figures passing between the trees. There was no doubt now. I was being watched. Adrenaline surged through me. I called the police again, whispering my concerns. They said a patrol car was on its way, but I knew I had to protect my home and myself until they arrived. I went to the back door and locked it firmly, doing the same with all the windows and entrances. As I did, the footsteps outside seemed to intensify, as if they knew I was aware of their presence. The wait for the police was agonizing. Each minute felt like an eternity, and every sound made me more tense. Finally, the patrol car's lights illuminated my driveway, and I heard the officers calling out. I ran to open the door, letting the officers in. They searched the area around the house, but found no one. The figures had disappeared, just as they had at the lake. "We'll keep patrolling the area, sir. Stay inside and keep safe," one of the officers said, trying to reassure me. Despite the police presence, the sense of insecurity remained. I knew something sinister was going on, something the police couldn't yet understand or stop. The experience at the lake and the pursuit at my home had changed my life forever, leaving me with a constant sense of fear and distrust. Reflecting on all this, I realized that some truths might never be revealed, and some mysteries are destined to remain as shadows in our lives, haunting us forever. I've always loved fishing. For me, there was nothing more relaxing than spending a calm morning by the edge of a lake, patiently waiting for a fish to bite. Living in Willowbrook, Illinois, I was lucky to have a hidden lake a short distance from my home. Few people knew about this place, making it perfect for a peaceful fishing trip, away from the noise and hustle of the city. On an ordinary day, I decided to enjoy the tranquility of the lake. The sun was just beginning to rise, lighting up the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. I grabbed my fishing gear, loaded it into the car, and drove to the trail that led to the lake. The path was narrow and surrounded by tall trees, creating a natural tunnel of green leaves. The morning breeze was fresh and invigorating, filling my lungs with clean air. When I arrived at the lake, I parked the car and grabbed my fishing rod. The surface of the water was calm, reflecting the sky and the trees around it like a mirror. I walked to my favorite spot on the shore and set up my gear. As I cast the line into the water, I let myself be enveloped by the peace of the place. The hours passed slowly, and I felt completely in harmony with the nature around me. It was one of those moments that made all the stress of everyday life seem distant and insignificant. But on that quiet morning, something strange happened. While I was sitting, watching my fishing line, I noticed movement on the opposite shore of the lake. It was hard to see clearly through the morning mist, but it looked like someone was there. What I saw intrigued me. A man was near the water, pouring something from a large barrel. The liquid was dark red, almost like blood. My heart raced, and a feeling of discomfort washed over me. Who was that man, and what was he doing? I decided to investigate closer. I packed up my fishing gear and carefully began walking around the lake, trying not to make any noise. Each step I took heightened my curiosity and apprehension. As I got closer, I could see the man more clearly. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes and wearing a hat that hid part of his face. The liquid continued to flow from the barrel, mixing with the lake water. Finally, I gathered the courage and called out to him. "Hey, what are you doing there?" My voice sounded firm, though I was nervous. The man stopped and looked at me, his eyes shining strangely under the brim of his hat. For a moment, he said nothing, just observed me. Then, without answering, he closed the barrel and quickly walked away, disappearing into the dense forest. I stood there, trying to process what I had just seen. As I drove back home, I couldn't get the image of the man and the red liquid out of my mind. The encounter had been disturbing, and the feeling that something terribly wrong was happening wouldn't leave me alone. The winding road back to Willowbrook seemed longer than usual, and at every turn, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the mysterious man following me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. I tried to rationalize, telling myself I was just paranoid after such a strange encounter. But I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was following me. The silence in the car was oppressive, and the engine noise wasn't enough to calm my nerves. When I finally reached my street, I felt a brief sense of relief. The familiar, well-kept houses of Willowbrook offered a sense of security that the lake couldn't provide. I parked the car in my driveway and quickly got out, looking around to ensure no one had followed me. The street was deserted, but the fear persisted. I went inside and locked the door behind me, trying to calm my mind. The sense of security that my home usually provided felt fragile that night. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, and every little noise made my heart race. I decided to check the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. As I went through each room, the feeling of being watched didn't lessen. I returned to the living room and picked up my phone, considering calling the police to report what I'd seen. But what exactly would I say? A man pouring a red liquid into the lake? It sounded insane, but something needed to be done. Before I could decide, I heard a noise outside. My heart nearly stopped. I walked slowly to the window, trying not to make any noise. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. At first, I saw nothing, but then I noticed a shadow moving near the side of the house. Fear gripped me. I grabbed the gun I kept for emergencies and prepared myself. My heart was pounding, and my hands were trembling. I knew I had to be ready for anything. The shadow approached the window, and finally, I saw his face illuminated by the faint porch light. It was him, the man from the lake. His gaze was cold and determined, like he was hunting. Adrenaline surged through me. I pointed the gun at the door, waiting for him to try to get in. The silence was oppressive, and every second felt like an eternity. Then, I heard the doorknob turn. He was trying to enter. "I'm armed! Get out of here now!" I shouted, my voice firm despite my fear. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard hurried footsteps moving away. I ran to the window and saw the man disappearing into the darkness. He had fled, at least for now. The police arrived quickly, inspecting the surroundings of my house and promising a night patrol to ensure my safety. Although their words were reassuring, the sense of danger persisted. When they finally left, I kept the gun by my side on the couch and tried to calm down. I decided I needed to rest, but I knew I wouldn't sleep deeply. I locked all the doors and windows again, making sure the house was well secured. I left some lights on, hoping it would help me feel a bit safer. As I prepared for bed, the fear was still present. I placed the gun next to the bed and lay down, my mind spinning. Every little sound made me jump, and the silence of the house seemed threatening. I knew I had to be prepared for anything. Shortly after midnight, I woke up to a noise. My heart raced, and I grabbed the gun instinctively. I stayed still, listening intently. The sound came again, this time clearer. Someone was trying to force the back door. I got up silently and went to the bedroom door, opening it slowly. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move, and I could hear the cautious footsteps of the intruder. My breathing was heavy, and the fear was palpable. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The footsteps stopped, and an oppressive silence filled the house. For a moment, I thought maybe he had fled, but then I heard the back doorknob turn. He was inside the house. I walked slowly down the hallway, keeping the gun ready. When I reached the living room, I saw the silhouette of the man from the lake, standing in the darkness. His eyes gleamed with a menacing intensity. He took a step toward me, and I knew I had to act. "Get out of here," I shouted, pointing the gun at him. He hesitated for a moment, but then continued to advance, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I warned you," I said, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, and the man screamed, stumbling backward. He fell to the floor, clutching his arm where the bullet had hit. Fear and adrenaline surged through me, but I knew I couldn't let him get up. "Leave now, or next time I won't miss," I threatened, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. The man looked at me, his eyes filled with hatred. He slowly got up, keeping his hand on his injured arm, and started to move away. I stood there, watching his every move until he finally went out the back door and disappeared into the night. I called the police again, and they arrived shortly after. They inspected the house and found blood trails leading into the forest, but the man had vanished. The officers promised to increase patrols in the area and start a more intensive search. The next morning, the police returned to investigate the lake. They found traces of the red liquid in the water, but couldn't identify its origin. The mysterious man was never found, and the contents of the barrel remained a mystery. I spent the following days trying to return to normal, but the memory of that night continued to haunt me. I avoided the lake and made sure my house was always locked and secure. The feeling of being watched never completely left me, and every little sound at night made me relive the fear. Although the police continued their investigation, it seemed the man from the lake had disappeared without a trace. The mystery of what he was doing and why he followed me was never solved. The only thing I knew for sure was that that night had changed my life forever. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how fragile our sense of security can be. Things we take for granted can be ripped away from us in an instant. Life in Willowbrook continued, but I was never the same after that night, with the mystery of the lake always hanging over me like a shadow that never disappears. My father was always passionate about fishing. Ever since I was a kid, he would take me to rivers and lakes, teaching me how to cast the line and wait patiently. Some of my best memories are from those trips, just him and me, surrounded by the tranquility of nature. But this story isn't about me, it's about one of the scariest fishing trips my father ever had, a story he rarely mentions, and one that left scars on his soul. On this particular trip, my father, Tom, and his friends, Mike, Steve, and Bill, decided to fish in a remote location they had heard about from other fishermen. They said it was an isolated, almost untouched place, and the fishing was excellent. Eager for adventure, my dad and his friends meticulously planned everything. They loaded the boat with supplies, fishing rods, bait, and essentials for a few days away from civilization. On the morning of departure, the weather was perfect. The sky was clear and a gentle breeze was blowing, making the trip even more enjoyable. They drove for hours, leaving the city and venturing onto increasingly narrow and isolated roads. Finally, they arrived at the spot they had been told about, a lake surrounded by dense forests, far from any sign of human life. They unloaded the boat and pushed it into the water, eager to start fishing. The lake was serene, the clear waters reflecting the blue sky. They chose a spot near the center of the lake, where fishing promised to be abundant. My dad and his friends laughed and chatted excitedly, each sharing past fishing stories and how they hoped to catch the biggest fish this time. The day passed quickly, with many fish being caught and camaraderie among them growing. The surrounding nature was stunning, with tall trees and occasional wildlife sightings in the distance. The sound of the water and the bird songs provided a perfect soundtrack for fishing. As the sun began to set, they decided it was time to return to shore and set up camp. They pitched their tents, lit a campfire, and prepared dinner. Conversation flowed naturally, and laughter echoed through the forest as night deepened. It was a perfect first night. The next morning, with the sun still low on the horizon, my father and his friends woke up expecting another productive day of fishing. The gentle breeze from the previous night had disappeared, replaced by an eerie calm. As they prepared to return to the lake, they noticed something unusual in the air. A dense, abnormally thick fog began to form, creeping over the water and enveloping the surrounding forest. At first, they thought it was just morning mist, but soon realized it was different. The fog seemed almost alive, moving in a sinister way, as if it had a will of its own. "This doesn't look normal," said Mike, worriedly staring at the lake slowly disappearing into the fog. "Let's wait a bit, see if it passes," suggested Steve, trying to stay calm. My dad and Bill agreed, settling near the extinguished campfire while watching the fog grow denser. Time passed slowly, and the fog only seemed to intensify, creating an oppressive and claustrophobic environment. The trees around them were barely visible, and the lake had vanished from sight. "I think it's best to try calling home. Let them know we're okay," suggested Bill, pulling out his cell phone. The others did the same, each trying to find a signal. They moved away from the camp, climbing small elevations and holding their phones in the air, hoping to catch a bar of service. But the fog seemed to block everything, even radio waves. There was no signal. "Nothing, no service," said my dad, frustrated. "Me neither. We'll keep trying, but let's not stray too far," replied Steve, worry evident in his voice. The group returned to the camp, sitting silently around the extinguished fire. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, and each of them felt a growing unease. The dense, impenetrable fog seemed to bring with it an omen of something bad. "Is anyone else hearing that?" asked the mic, breaking the silence. Everyone was alert, listening carefully. A soft, almost imperceptible sound began to stand out in the oppressive silence. It was a clicking noise, rhythmic and constant, coming from within the fog. "What the hell is that?" murmured Bill, his face pale with worry. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's getting closer," said my dad, trying to identify the direction of the sounds. The tension increased with each click, each sound seeming closer and more threatening. They stood up, looking around with wide eyes, trying to see something through the thick fog. The clicking noises intensified, cutting through the silence with disturbing regularity. It was as if something invisible was moving around them, hidden by the thick fog. Each click was like a time marker, making my father and his friends' hearts beat faster. "We need to get out of here," suggested Steve, looking around with wide eyes. "This isn't normal." "But where do we go?" asked Bill, his voice trembling. "We can't see anything in this fog." The clicking noises began to alternate with soft footsteps, as if something was stalking around the camp. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and each of them felt the growing fear. "Maybe it's just some animal," Mike tried, but his voice betrayed a lack of conviction. My dad, trying to stay calm, gestured for everyone to stick together. They moved towards the center of the camp, trying to find some comfort in each other's company. "Stay alert. Anything strange, shout," said my dad, his voice firm, despite the panic growing inside him. The clicking noises continued, now accompanied by low, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. It was as if the fog was full of whispering voices, speaking in an unknown language. The group was tense, each sound making them jump and look around frantically. "This is getting really weird," murmured Steve, clenching his fists in nervousness. Suddenly, the clicks and murmurs stopped, leaving a deep and unsettling silence. For a moment, they all stood still, trying to understand what was happening. The silence was deafening, and the lack of the noises that had scared them now seemed even more terrifying. Then they saw the shadows moving in the fog. Indistinct, dark, human-like shapes danced among the trees, almost invisible in the dense mist. The group was paralyzed, their eyes wide in horror as they watched the figures slowly approach. "Who are they?" whispered Bill, panic evident in his voice. My dad tried to focus in the direction of the shadows, but the fog made it impossible to see clearly. The figures seemed to glide through the mist, their movements fluid and silent. The tension increased with each moment, and the fear was almost palpable. "We need to get out of here, now," said Mike, his voice full of urgency. They began to retreat slowly, trying not to make any noise as they moved away from the figures in the fog. But no matter how much they moved, the shadows seemed to follow them, always keeping the same distance, like predators playing with their prey. The clicks began again, louder and closer this time. The pressure of fear was overwhelming, and the group knew they needed to find a way to escape this nightmare. With each step, the feeling of being hunted grew, and the fog seemed to close around them like a trap. As they moved through the fog, the figures took shape, revealing people in tribal attire from a distant past. Their outfits of animal skins, feathers, and bone adornments, along with menacing face paint, were terrifying. Each carried primitive spears and axes, but their wide, cold eyes were the most frightening. The atmosphere was thick with fear. My dad and his friends felt their blood run cold, realizing they were being watched. The tribal group advanced slowly, eyes fixed on the intruders, weapons ready. "We need to get out of here, now," whispered my dad urgently. They moved faster, trying to distance themselves from the tribal group, but the thick fog made it hard to see. The sound of the pursuers' footsteps grew louder and panic set in. "To the boat!" yelled Steve, pointing where he believed the boat was. They ran, hearts pounding wildly with the fog swallowing everything around them. The tribal figures followed closely, the sounds of their steps and clicks echoing ominously. The run was desperate, each fighting fear and exhaustion. Bill tripped and fell. Mike and Steve helped him up, but the delay let the pursuers get closer. My dad looked back, seeing the cold eyes of the tribal men. They had to keep moving. Finally, they saw the boat's silhouette through the fog. The sight gave them energy, and they ran with all their strength. They reached the boat, pushing it into the water as the pursuers neared. "Quick, quick!" shouted my dad, jumping into the boat and rowing desperately. The others followed, and within seconds they were furiously rowing away from shore. The tribal men stopped at the water's edge, watching darkly as the group pulled away. The boat's safety didn't bring immediate relief. They rowed with all their might, adrenaline and fear still driving them. The increasing distance from the pursuers finally brought some calm. My dad looked at his friends, all exhausted and silent. The experience was traumatic, and processing it would take time. Only the sound of oars cutting through the water and the heavy breathing of the men broke the silence. They kept rowing until the fog began to dissipate, revealing the path back to the opposite shore. The danger still felt present, but the distance between them and the nightmare grew. When they reached their starting point, they were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. They got out of the boat in silence, lost in their thoughts, trying to understand what they had experienced. My dad knew this fishing trip would never be forgotten, forever marked by the terror and the fog that almost consumed them.